This is Research Like a Pro, episode 132, Grafting Family Branches, Part 2. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Nicole Dyer, co-host of Research Like a Pro, and I'm here with accredited genealogist and co-host Diana Elder. Hi, Diana.
Hi, Nicole. I'm looking forward to our discussion on the podcast today.
What have you been working on lately?
I did a bunch of Roots Tech videos. Maybe our listeners don't know, but Roots Tech is going virtual this year and it's free for everybody. So if you haven't signed up yet, you can go register. And I have got a lot of videos on there. This year, they only wanted 20-minute videos because they found that I guess our attention span's getting worse. And that's what people really watched when they were watching the hour-long ones. They would watch for 20 minutes and then be done. So we're only doing 20-minute videos. But I had 2 or 3 proposals that were accepted that were an hour long, and I broke those up into parts. So crazy as it might seem, I ended up doing 18 videos. And some of those are just little short 5-minute ones because you can do those as well. So I kind of had a crazy few weeks getting all those recorded and submitted.
It was crazy, and I only had 6. But yeah, those little 5-minute videos were kind of fun. They're called tips and tricks videos, and we were able to submit several of those. So it was fun to have the opportunity to share a few little tips and then to do a couple normal class sessions as well. And of course, the 20-minute time limit was difficult to meet because typically we present a lecture that's an hour long. So it just forced me to say things very concisely.
Me too. And I had to re-record a few things because I tended to ramble and I was over my time limit. So I had to do some re-recording at times. But that's okay. I think those videos are going to be fun. And from what we understand, they will be available for a whole year. So you don't have to watch everything in 3 days. You'll have time to space it out and see a variety of content. So I think it's going to be kind of revolutionary how RootSec is putting this all together from what I've seen.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to see how it goes. All right, well, our announcements for the day are to join our newsletter to make sure you get our weekly Monday email with coupons and deals and new blog posts and episodes of the podcast. And then also our Research Like a Pro with DNA online course is out. So check that out on our website.
We're excited about that. And if you don't know much about our courses, it's just work as you go. So you get to decide if you're going to spend a day, a week, a month, whatever on each module. And then we have our monthly office hours, which are really fun because you can submit your own questions and then come on the live Zoom call and we talk about your question and we get ideas from everybody who's there. And so you can get some really good ideas just on your specific research problems. So we really enjoy meeting up with our course people on our office hours that are every month. So let's talk a little bit about the previous episode, which is leading us to this episode. We are talking all about caring for your family tree and how to make sure that those generational links are correct. And this whole podcast and article that I wrote about it all came from Nicole and I attaching the wrong ancestor years and years ago when we were beginning genealogists. We had decided that our ancestor, Malissa Elizabeth Welch, had parents of Meredith and Susannah Welch in South Carolina based on one document, and that was the 1850 census that had an Elizabeth Welch of the right age in South Carolina. And then years later, Nicole discovered that that was incorrect. And so we're going to talk all about how the research process that we teach, the RLP process, can really help figure out these mistakes that we've made in our genealogy, or as we're doing new research to make sure we're doing correct genealogy.
Yep, it was exciting to find the correct parents because then we could have the right people in our family tree and extend that line back correctly.
Yeah, I think there's always that feeling like, oh man, what have I done when you discover a mistake? But I'm pretty sure that there is nobody alive that has an absolutely perfect family tree, whether it's an incorrect ancestor or just a date or a place. I mean, it's the past, and we're just relying on the documents that have survived. And of course, we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. We just need to learn how to correct them and how to verify. So, in this episode, we're going to go through the RLP process and use it to show how we discovered correct information on our gal. So, our objective for this was to discover and document the parents of Malissa Elizabeth Welch, born 10 September 1844 in Sumter County, South Carolina, and died 5 January 1887 in Cameron, Milam County, Texas. Melissa married John Christian Harris on 27 July 1865 in Burleson County, Texas. So we have a lot of information in there, dates and places. But when we started, we really only had one record. We started with the death certificate of my great-grandfather, where he named his mother as Elizabeth Welch. But after we've created an objective, we've got this objective to really verify parents, then what's the next thing that we do?
Analyze the timeline.
Yeah, and we have to go through all of our sources and really analyze for the source and information and evidence. So when we look at the sources, we want to really think about, are they original? Are they derivative? Are they authored? So in this case, I had an original source for her parents, and it was actually from the John C. Harris Family Bible. This is one of those exciting things that happened when we were communicating with other researchers, and another researcher had a scan of the original page. And I remember getting that email, and it was so exciting. But a family Bible is an interesting source because it is original. It's the first time it's written down, possibly ever. And especially in Texas, where they didn't do birth certificates or any kind of birth records, a family Bible might be the only recording of a birth. But was this Bible created at the time of her birth? Well, no, it wasn't. It was done many, many years later. So it makes the information a little bit less reliable. What do you think about that, Nicole?
Yeah, there's so much to talk about with the Family Bible. It's an original source. I always just try to think, is it the first time this was recorded, or was somebody transcribing it or translating it or copying it? So if you have the actual images of the Bible pages, that's original. And then the information, you have to know who the person is that is writing the family information. So sometimes you don't know with the Bible. Did we know in this case?
No, we did not know. We had no idea. I kind of think it was one of the younger daughters, because you can always look at the handwriting, and the handwriting was all the same. So it was obvious all this information was written down at the same time, the same ink, the same handwriting. And the last person listed was Doc Harris, my ancestor, and he was born in 1886. So all the people that were born before that, they were just included in this list. So it was at least after 1886 that this record was made. But I really don't know who would have been writing it down.
And sometimes you can tell by who has the Bible. So which cousin has it, and you can look at their line back to the common ancestor and see which child they descend through and kind of ask them where they got the pages from or that kind of thing. And that's been a successful way in the past to kind of figure it out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The trouble with this one was it was just images of pages, and you can see that they're not even in the Bible anymore. Somebody had taken them out of the Bible and then digitized them. So somebody just had these loose pages in their records, and the images were being passed around through the family genealogist.
So the Bible itself, the pages were about the John C. Harris and Melissa family. So those two were the parents, and then it listed all of their children.
Right.
So it didn't tell us anything about Melissa's parents, right?
Nothing. And it listed her name as Melissa Harris, and it gave the actual birth date of September 10th, 1844. But this one did not give a place. That came from the censuses. This one just gave it a specific date of her birth. So, you would imagine that would be probably one of the older daughters that knew her mother's birth year, and her father probably was still alive. He didn't die till 1915, and she knew all the birth dates of all the children. So that would be my guess, but I, of course, can't verify that. But here's an interesting thing. Before I got these original pages, I got a derivative source. And that derivative source was another researcher who had made a copy of these family Bible pages. And she had written everything out. But the interesting thing about her derivative copy of that family Bible was she had done some annotations. She had made some little notes on it. And I thought that was really interesting. So, could this be a clue? Because the notes were by Ruth M. Harris, and she was the youngest child of John Harris by his third wife. So, not even Melissa's daughter, but John's daughter. So, that makes me wonder if maybe she was possibly the one that had the Bible pages. I don't know. It's such a mystery to know who actually compiled the Bible. But this Ruth, who was the youngest child, had done the transcription.
That's really neat. So after Melissa died, John C. Harris got married again, and then he got married a third time. And the third wife, her children had the Bible.
I think maybe so.
That makes sense. It was probably in the possession of John C. Harris.
Yeah. So this younger daughter has some notes, her notes from the transcription. She notes who the father was, and she notes who he was married and their children. So I think that's an interesting thing too to think about, that a derivative source can have errors enter in. For instance, for Melissa's name, instead of writing Welch, she thought it was Wilch. And so she transcribed it as WI, but looking at the original, to me, it looks more like an E.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something we always have to take into consideration, that with a derivative source, there could be some errors. But then you also have these annotations and notes, which can give you more clues about the actual record.
That's cool.
Anyway, the Bible pages and the transcription are kind of fun sources to analyze and look at.
Yeah, they really are. The death date of Melissa Welch being 1887, right after Doc was born in 1886, is there any chance she could have written the births of her own children before she died?
Maybe that is always a possibility. And if we had the actual Bible, we could look at the date that it was published and see when they would have purchased it, maybe. But without that, you can't tell that. So I don't know. My feeling is that it was probably later, but I don't know.
It is interesting, though, to look at the handwriting and see that it's all consistent, and that was a really good clue. So good job.
Yeah, because I do have another Bible record where the ink is different, handwriting is different, and you can clearly see different people adding information to the Bible. So if anyone has a Bible record, there are some things that you can really look at to better analyze that. Well, let's go on and talk about an authored source. And this is a family story or a biographical sketch. It can be an online family tree or research report, any of those things. And we are seeing a lot of those types of sources on the online trees, especially Ancestry. Anytime you write something and upload it to your tree, it'll probably show up as a hint in somebody else's tree for that person, and they can attach it. Nicole, I've seen some of your life sketches that you've uploaded and copied into other trees. And so I'll see there's a story about this ancestor, and then I go look at it, and it's one that you've written, which always kind of cracks me up because I already have that. So, but we just have to realize that those authored sources, that they could be great clues and they could have absolutely accurate information, but they could also have inaccurate information that's just been copied. So again, we have to do good analysis, and we can do our own authored sources when we figure things out and upload to the online trees some information that we've actually sourced and documented.
I'm just reading my description of Malissa Welch's name, and I had written a reason why her name was Melissa and not Elizabeth on the family search tree, because every time you change something in the tree, it asks you for a reason. And so I really fleshed out this reason statement with my proof. But, the thing I left off is Doc's death certificate that does say her name is Elizabeth. And there was one other daughter, Melissa's daughter, Debbie, and on her death certificate, it says her mother's name is Lizzie.
So what do we do with those death certificates? Well, let's talk a little bit about Doc's death certificate. We've referenced that several times, and that was our starting point. He was our direct ancestor. Obviously, on a death certificate, the person who died doesn't generally give the name of their parents, right? They're usually not the informant for their own death. But in his case, he was in the Eastern State Hospital at Veneta, Oklahoma, when he died, and he was in this institution the last 17 years of his life. So the informant was hospital records. And I'm thinking he gave that information when he was admitted to the hospital. And as far as his understanding, his mother's name was Elizabeth Welch. So this is a little bit different case, that the informant was actually the deceased, as far as I can tell and as much as I know about his situation. And the other interesting thing is he was the informant for his younger sister, Devia Dove's death certificate, where he lists the mother as Lizzie Welch. So in his mind, his mother was named Elizabeth Welch. He called her Elizabeth and Lizzie, but those are the only two instances that we have that name. So the youngest child, somewhere he got that name.
It's so interesting. You just really wonder where he got that. Maybe that was her middle name and she never went by it, or we just don't know.
Well, an interesting thing that I found is one of her older daughters named a daughter Melissa Elizabeth. So I am wondering if that was her full name. And that's kind of what I've called her by now, because I feel like there's got to be some reason why we have that name. Anyway, when we are verifying our records, it's important to take apart these sources and think about who the informant was. And so firsthand knowledge from that death certificate, of course, is the date of death, which was given by the doctor and who signed the death certificate. And so, we can be pretty sure that that date of death is really accurate. But then that secondary information, the birth date of Doc Harris and the name of his mother, even if it was directly from Doc, he only knew the birth date and his mother from what people told him, because she died right after his birth. And of course, he wouldn't remember the day he was born. So that's secondary information. And it's good information, but we always want to make sure we have more than one source and to really analyze that. And then we have that undetermined information, which is from the census, because generally we don't know who gave the information on the census. And in both censuses for Elizabeth Melissa, her name is Melissa. So if the head of household, John C. Harris, was supposed to give the information, he called her Melissa.
That was a really tricky thing to figure out as a beginning genealogist. Now we have the tools to analyze that information and really figure out who was the informant and what kind of knowledge did they have, if it was secondhand or firsthand. And now that's just such an important tool to use with every document we look at and analyze that information. And did the person who gave that information know what they were talking about or not? So I think that's a really important thing to teach beginners.
I agree, because it really can make a big difference. One of the things that I talk about in our book is the birth certificate, this is on a different line, of Christine Schultz, and she is kind of the same situation as Doc. She was born and then her mother died in childbirth. That all happened January 11th of 1925. Well, the doctor didn't get around to doing a birth certificate for Christine till August, 8 months later, and he stated her birth as being February 11th. And obviously she couldn't be born a month after her mother had died. So that was incorrect information, but you would think the doctor who was present at the birth would have the date correct. And so, I had to do some digging and see that, oh, he didn't fill this birth certificate out and he just forgot the actual month. So we have so much detective work to look at our records, especially when things don't add up. That's when we have to make sure we're correlating. Well, let's talk about evidence. Now that we've talked about sources and information, and evidence is what we pull from the source information to answer our research question. So, what direct evidence do we have? Well, that family Bible gave us direct evidence. It specifically answered the question of when Melissa was born, and it has on the marriages page a specific date for when she was married, July 22nd, 1865. The family Bible doesn't give any places. So, we talked in the last episode how excited we were when a family search hint gave us the actual record, and we found out it was in a completely different county, Burleson County, Texas. We've got that direct evidence, which is great. It answers our question, but again, it could be incorrect, just depending on the informant and the situation. Then we have indirect evidence when we have to combine it with something else. And we see a lot of indirect evidence when we're working with census records, especially before 1880 when we don't have any relationships listed and we see this couple and then all these children, and we can deduce that they're probably the parents and these are the children. But we always have to stop and think, well, is that the mother of the children, or is this a second wife or a third wife, or is it an older daughter? In the research project I just barely did, there was an older daughter who was going by a different name listed right after the man. And at first I thought that she was a second wife. And then I realized, no, she is not a second wife. So we have to be so careful in those censuses because they really give us a lot of different pieces of information and we have good evidence coming from them. But if it's not specifically stated as a relationship, it's just indirect.
Yep, that's another mistake that I made, was assuming that because they're listed together on the census, they're parent-child. And usually they are. We can infer that, but we never know for sure on those pre-1880 census enumerations.
Yeah, and it's always good to just have that in the back of our mind that we need to verify with other records. If we can go find them in 1880 or later censuses where they actually list relationships, or find other records that will bring it all together, then we can really use those earlier censuses better. We also have got negative evidence, and this is when there's an absence of a situation. So my ancestor, Doc Harris, never appears in the census with his mother, of course, because she died right after his birth in 1886. And he doesn't appear in a census till 1900 because that 1890 census was destroyed mainly and doesn't exist for his specific location. And in that household, we've got a Rebecca. Looking at that, if I didn't know the family situation, I would maybe think that that was his mother, because we've got John Harris, who's the head of household, listing his wife, and then there's a stepson and then a daughter, son. Well, those relationships all go back to the head of house. And because there's Rebecca and then there's a stepson, we can make some connections there and realize that the first wife had died and this is a second wife. And so even though it doesn't tell us that, we can use some negative evidence there. Now, John Harris has remarried.
When we correlate all of the census records and look at all the clues, we notice these type of things. That's why it's so important to compare and contrast records from different times of the person's life and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's really important that with census records, we get every single one for every year of their life. And you may think, well, I know my grandmother, I know my great grandmother, but those census records give you a little clue into the household. And sometimes there's extended family living there, and that gives you clues to a whole nother branch of the family, or you can just learn all sorts of things. So it's really good practice to make sure you have every census of a person's life and to correlate all the information that can be found between those different censuses. So, some tips as you are analyzing your evidence. You can do different things, like I like the term evidence linkage bundles. from Robert Anderson's book.
Yeah, that's from the book Elements of Genealogical Analysis by Robert Charles Anderson.
Yeah, I like how he talked about linkage bundles in that book. And he was doing research in colonial America in New England and really showed how you can take all these different pieces of evidence and put them together to separate people of the same name or to make a real case for a person's identity. So I like that. And sometimes when I'm working on cases, I will, in my research log, do some kind of color coding. And then as their identities separate out and it becomes clear who is who, then I can put them together. You can use separate pages of a spreadsheet or you can use a table, trying to put together these pieces of information and evidence for individuals.
Yeah, I like how he talked about in the linkage bundles, there has to be a reason that you're making that linkage. You can't just take two separate things and say, name is the same. There has to be something that helps you make that linkage beyond just the name.
Exactly. Locality or maybe the fan club, the time and place. Well, in the research process, after we have analyzed what we actually have, then we have to do some locality research and we can pay attention to the locations in the timeline. The whole point of learning about the locality is to do new research to see if there are more records that can shed some light on what we have found. You know, you might have an ancestor on the family search family tree and there's only 3 or 4 sources. And when you look at them, you realize that they're really scarce. There are only maybe mentions of that person in their children's death certificates. They're not even sources for that person's life. And so you're going to have to do some research and flesh out their life story. So you'll have to decide on a location to research. And this is where you can do that locality guide and learn about the history and geography. Get some maps in there, some links to websites, learn about jurisdictions. Sometimes we only do our record on the county level, and we forget that there could be records on the state level or the country level or the town level. And it's so important to make sure we're hitting each of those levels. I know I found some great records in unusual places like the Georgia State Legislature. I found a petition for a divorce for my ancestor in 1804. So, I mean, that was a crazy record. I had no idea that would be on a state level. So, keep an open mind for that.
Yeah, it's important, I think, with these cases where there are multiple people with the same name, that we look for those records that could really help us differentiate them. And we need to do reasonably exhaustive research so that we can really figure it out. And that does include finding those more unique record types that might be in a place we haven't been looking or just a repository we're not familiar with.
Right. And we also have to keep in mind those boundary changes because the county that they are living in 1880, when we are looking at them, could have not existed in 1840 when we should be researching. And so we'd need to look at a parent county or the county next door when a little piece of that was sliced off and put into the county. Sometimes we can figure out where our ancestors were living within a county if we have a land record that's really specific, but sometimes we really have no idea where exactly they were. And we need to keep in mind that records could be all around that area or even in a whole different county, like with that marriage record. So, to do your locality research, I just recommend always to start with the Family Search Wiki because that'll point you to several other places, and then to use the catalog to see what's available online at Family Search or at the Family History Library. And then to expand out, sometimes the easiest way is just to do a Google search for your locality and see if you can pull up some county historical societies or libraries. There's so many different ways to find information on your locality. And doing that guide gives you a place to put it all together. And then from that, you can make your research plan. You know, you've discovered some new places to search and some new records, and then you can make a plan.
Yes, the research planning is such an important part.
So when we look at a plan for our case study, what do we know? First thing we want to do is make that summary of known facts. And I like to put this in a table. And it helps me just to get clear in my head what we really actually know. We knew that Melissa was born 1844 in South Carolina. She got married in July of 1865 in Texas, in Burleson County, and that she lived in Milam County, Texas in 1870 and 1880, and that she died there. So that's not really a lot to go on. And this is so common for our women that we don't have them mentioned in many records. We're even lucky to have that birth date from the Bible records. Often we don't have a specific birth date. We only have an estimation from a census. But we can still create a good hypothesis about what might have happened.
What's interesting is that the objective that we made at the beginning had a specific place of birth because we had assumed, that Meredith was her father and that she was born in Sumter County. But reviewing the timeline and then making our summary of known facts, we realized we actually didn't have a specific place of birth. We just had South Carolina.
Right. And sometimes our objectives will have incorrect information because we have to start somewhere. We have to put down what we know at the time.
Right.
So our hypothesis is obviously she moved to Texas. If she was born in South Carolina, somehow she had to get to Texas by 1865 when she married. And usually young women don't move out on their own. They usually move because there was a family migration. And we know from our previous research that Southern migration typically was in stages, South Carolina, and then they maybe went to Georgia or Arkansas or Alabama or Mississippi, and then they would get into Texas. So, I'm sure there are cases where somebody said, okay, in South Carolina, I'm going all the way to Texas, but generally they stopped along the path. And so opening up your mind to that possibility that they might be somewhere in between can be helpful. And then our other hypothesis was generally they moved as a group. So could there be some other Welch family members near Melissa in Texas even? If they all moved as a family, shouldn't there be some other Welches in Texas?
Absolutely. And that was one of the things that tipped me off because I was looking for other relatives that were around her in Texas and there weren't any. Meredith or Susannah, they stayed in Sumter.
And so it wouldn't be likely that this young woman would just go out on her own and end up in Texas. Really good clue. Once you kind of got your hypothesis that's guiding you, you can identify some sources and a strategy. Obviously, we needed more information on this. So if we're saying that she was born in South Carolina and she'd moved to Texas by 1865 and that she had followed this migration pattern, maybe we could look more at census records. Maybe we could look for some more marriage records. Could we look for some fan clubs, some more Welches? When you're working on your research plan, you really want to think about a couple of things. One is to look for original records if you only have an index record. And I see this so much that the index has very limited information. And when you get that original record, it can open up your research. So you always want to look for original. You want to work on the fan club, those friends, associates, and neighbors. And then you also want to think what's missing. Is there a census that you don't have for the family? Is there a possibility of a birth or a death record or a cemetery record? Think about what else you could be looking for. So we did create a strategy based on this and found some really good things that really opened up the research. Here's a possible research plan. Find the original marriage record, which, when we were doing this research, we didn't have. Look again at that 1850 census. We had assumed that the Elizabeth Welch in Sumter County was ours, but maybe we need to open our mind up, and maybe she was going by Melissa and could be in a different southern state in South Carolina. And then look in the 1860 census, which was missing for Elizabeth or Melissa. Search the 1870 census of Milam County, Texas for other Welch families. That's where we know our gal was living. Were there other Welch families around that could be her relatives? And then look for marriage records in Texas, because if the family had moved out, it makes sense that any siblings of Melissa could also have gotten married somewhere in Texas. So that's a possible research plan. And as you're doing your research planning, of course, you can put those in different order. You can have different records, but you want to search for things that will make the most sense and that will give you the most bang for your buck. We're not going to start with land records right away because there's just so many other things we can do first, right?
Yeah, and land records may not be as applicable to finding out parents of a woman in this case because we have no reason to believe that she ever owned land her own self
Right.
yet. We need to do a little more research first.
So there's a logical way to go about this. And I think the more experience you get, the more you kind of realize a good order. You don't have to really worry so much about making a really good strategy for your research plan. Just get 4 or 5 things down that you want to search. So once you've got your plan, then it's time to do the research log and to do your source citations as you're looking at those sources. So when we looked at that original marriage record, which did come up as a hint, and we've talked about before, it didn't have anything on the parents. Texas, all they did was just really simple. You get the date of the marriage license and who it was performed by and the return when they brought it back in. So it's great to have the record, but it didn't give any clues about the actual parents of Melissa.
And one interesting thing to note on this marriage record that popped up as a hint on Family Search is we didn't download the original image of that marriage record. We just attached it to her in Family Search. And then afterward, apparently the contract changed between Family Search and the county. And now you have to go into a Family Search library or center in order to view the original image, which was disappointing because we didn't take the time to download it. So we learned a very valuable lesson that we always should download the images of our ancestors' records to save on our own computer.
Right. And you may think that it will always be there on Family Search, but they are working under contracts with all of these repositories. So it's another good reason to keep your own family tree on your computer as well as your own document images. Well, if we are going back and redoing some census research, in the 1850 census, then we could look at some other people. What did you find out about that 1850 census, Nicole?
Well, the original one that I had found with Meredith and Susannah being the parents of Elizabeth, I also found there was another census in 1850 with a possible parent for Elizabeth Melissa Welch, and it was for a girl named Melissa and not Elizabeth. And it was also in South Carolina, and the parents' names were different. Obviously, it's a different household. And it was just another candidate for our Melissa. And this one looked to be a little more probable to me since in all the other records she went by Melissa, records of her during her life, not of her children's death certificates. So in her marriage in 1865, she was going by Melissa. In 1870, she was going by Melissa. In 1880, she was Melissa. So it makes sense that in 1850, she would be Melissa as well. So in 1850, it was George Welch and an inferred wife named Lucinda and their inferred children, including a Melissa Welch who was born in 1844 in South Carolina. And this family was living in Pickens County in Alabama. So on the migration path, probably toward Texas, in between South Carolina and Texas. And a lot of Southern families migrated that direction, ending up in Texas and Oklahoma.
Right. And the really great thing about looking at these census records is taking note of the birthplace of all the family members because Melissa was the last one born in South Carolina. So we know from the census, or we can surmise that in 1844, when she was born, they were still in South Carolina. But then the next child, George Welch, age 3, was born in Alabama. So sometime between 1844 and 1847, the family moved. So that's always really fun when you see a specific migration path just from the birthplace of the children. And of course, you have to correlate that with other records, but sometimes that's just spot on. So the other great thing about this census was it gives us a lot of family members. We have all these different siblings. There's 5 older siblings for Melissa and 2 younger siblings. So if we can find any of those people out in Texas near her, that would be some really good evidence that this is her birth family, right?
Absolutely.
So the next thing on the research plan was the 1860 census. And, sometimes there's just a census that the family's missing on. I have run into this a lot in the South. And I think one of the reasons could be that they were migrating. Perhaps that was when they were on the move from Alabama to Texas and they just got missed in the census We don't know, but every once in a while it does happen that a household is missed, even though the censuses are usually pretty good with being inclusive of everyone. And then the 1870 census, looking for some of those same name individuals, there was a census that had two people that were the same, a Susan and a George Welch, and they were right there in Milam County, Texas, same places as Melissa. But what did you notice about this census?
It was a little tricky because the mother's name was not Lucinda like I thought it should be. It was Cynthia. So it took me, some time to decide this was our family, but ultimately living in the same place, Milam County, and two siblings of Melissa, George and Susan, matching up kind of gave me the clue that it was the right family. And if I remember right, they were really living close to Melissa and her married family.
Yeah, those names again, those names just kept tripping us up in this situation. But when we got to the fifth part of the research plan looking at marriages, right around the area of Milam and Burleson, where we have Melissa, her marriage in Burleson, her census is in Milam, there is also Robertson County. It's really, really close. And there were several Welch marriages for those people that were in that 1850 census. There was William and James and Mariah, and they were all married 1855, 1857 in this Robertson County. So it seemed like this whole family had come out to Robertson, and for whatever reason, somebody went down to Burleson, and that's where Melissa was married. But having all these marriages kind of clustered adds another piece of evidence that this is her family.
That was one of the biggest clues as I was doing this research, finding the family all living in Texas and getting married there.
Yeah, that's really key. And it comes back to that fan club. If you're stuck on your ancestor, go research associates and neighbors and see if you can find a group coming together to a new place. Well, to kind of finish up this story in revisiting this and doing the research, of course, we would keep good notes in a research log and keep source citations, and then finally write up a conclusion. And so, some of the things when you're writing up your conclusions that you need to do is to correlate all of the evidence. So, one of the interesting things was figuring out the real name of Melissa's mother. She was Cynthia in one census, and she was Lucinda in another census, and neither one of those were actually her real name, which was Lucindrilla. So, tell us a little bit about that story because that's fun.
I was searching for more about Lucinda and George Welch after finding they were the parents of Melissa and just trying to extend the data backwards into South Carolina. And I found that Lucinda's maiden name was Keaton based on one of her children's death certificates. And so I searched for Keatons in South Carolina, and I had a clue that they came from Pendleton because one of their daughters got married in Pendleton. So looking in Pendleton District for Keatons, I found there was one man who was the right age to be Lucinda's father. And I found his estate record, and it listed all of his 13 children. And one of the daughters was Lucindrilla, wife of George Welch. So that was just an amazing record. The only record I've ever found that lists her name as Lucindrilla.
Yeah, that was really fun to find that. And the interesting thing was that Melissa named a daughter Margaret Cinderella. And we had always looked at that name Cinderella and thought that was really interesting. So now I'm wondering if it was really maybe Lucindrella that she named her daughter and somehow it got written down or translated as Cinderella.
So Lucinda actually went by Cinderella in 1880. And I don't know if they just wrote it as Cinderella or Cinderella was what she went by, but it might have been, Cinderella, but then they thought of it as Cinderella as the Cinderella story became popular. Who knows? But
Interesting.
I think when she was younger, her name was Lucindrilla. And when you add illa to the end of a name, it kind of means like little girl. So I'm not even sure. Maybe her name really was Lucinda and she kind of went by Lucindrilla as a little girl. Who knows? Maybe that really was her full name. But then as she was older, she became Lucinda. One time on the census, they wrote her name as Cynthia, which could have just been an error. And then in 1880, she was listed as Cindrilla.
Oh my goodness. No wonder it was so tricky figuring this out between Elizabeth, Melissa, and then Cynthia, Lucinda, Lucinda. I mean, the women had these crazy names. Now they married men that were very solid, George and John.
I actually appreciated a more unique name, I guess, because George and John have their own unique challenges, especially John Harris.
So you're right. It was good having some different names. And with the siblings too, because one of them was Mariah, which is, not super unusual, but a little bit different. So, and it was nice having a lot of siblings to trace.
Mm-hmm.
One of them could be coincidence, but having three. Anyway, that was awesome that you were able to correct the parents. And then even better is the fact that DNA cousin matches are kind of coming through with the Keaton family. So it's fun when you see the DNA backing up what you've worked so hard to do with the documents.
It is. It is really fun to see that. And I think if I had done this research project now, it would have been a lot easier because there's several good DNA matches leading to the right parents.
Right. But, that's just the way it goes. We did the best we could at the time. So, our final thing, really, you need to write up a conclusion because obviously this is not easy to make the connection between Melissa Harris and Malissa Welch in Alabama. There has to be something written that you can share with other people. A research report with source citations is ideal because then anyone can follow your path and look at all of the sources, and it gives you a chance to explain everything really well. And you can upload this to Family Search, you can upload it to Ancestry, but if nothing else, you can use the notes feature on Ancestry or your own database to write a summary, and you can write a life sketch on Family Search. Just really important to write something to explain your research and resolve the conflicts and to be able to share with people. I love having research reports to share with my DNA cousins, and sometimes that really helps to make a connection when I say, I've got something I can share with you, and they'll respond to me. Writing is a great thing to do.
Yes, it is. It's wonderful to write up something and then to feel the confidence that you have completed the genealogical proof standard and applied it to your research, and you have a conclusion that will stand up to scrutiny.
Right. And so if you have a similar situation where you have somebody incorrect in your family tree and you discover it, then it's time to fix it. And luckily, we can fix it. We can go in and correct our own database first and then go fix our online tree. We can go work on the collaborative family trees. We might have to unmerge identities or create a second identity for people of the same name. There's ways to fix all of it. And of course, as we do that, we want to add the sources and make sure that everyone else will understand why we're making these changes. And finally, we might want to email cousins that have incorrect information if they've copied our incorrect information. We can offer our report and maybe link to the Family Search family tree or wiki tree if you've corrected information there. Whatever we can do to fix things and start getting things corrected, it's a good thing to do.
Yes, it is exciting to be able to fix that up and let others know what you found.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to us talk all about this case. And I hope it's given everyone some ideas of how to tackle your own family tree. And if you have something incorrect in it, don't feel bad because we did too. We can all fix our family trees and make our collaborative trees even better.
All right, everyone, have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our Research Like a Pro online course or join our next study group. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our eCourse or study group. If you like what you heard and would like to support this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.